Well, thanks for everyone for joining us this evening. I'm Michael Steinmacher, also known as Robert Steinmacher, but go by Michael. I'm the director of the Barr Memorial Library at Fort Knox, Kentucky. Tonight, we are pleased to host our guest, Owen Matthews. He's a journalist and author of books including Black Sun, Stalin's Children, Glorious Misadventures, and An Impeccable Spy. Mr. Matthews worked for years in Moscow newsrooms and served Newsweek as a bureau chief in both Istanbul and Moscow. His books have been translated into 28 languages. Tonight, we're going to be focusing on his new book, which is not my cell phone, but this, Red Traitor. So, Mr. Matthews, I have to apologize. I'm slipping back into the mode of when I was doing the podcast for the library. I was almost ready to welcome you to Off the Page, which was the podcast, but let's just welcome you to Authors at Your Library. Thank for being part of us tonight.
It's my great pleasure, Michael. It's wonderful that Zoom has put us together. Although actually, I think I may have been happier to be in Fort Knox myself. I've never been to Kentucky, but maybe sometime in the future. And thank you for your invitation.
Absolutely. So, for those of you all who are familiar with our author programs, we have a couple of different formats that we use, and we haven't used this format actually during the pandemic with our virtual programs, which basically it's going to be a little bit of a conversation tonight. I have some questions for Mr. Matthews that may or may not anticipate yours. We definitely want your questions. We'd like you to put them in the chat, and anything that we don't cover, we'll definitely pose them to him. So, first of all, I'd like you to tell us just a little bit about your new book, Red Traitor.
Well, it's the second part of a trilogy. It's set in the Soviet Union in the early 1960s. So obviously the background is the Cold War, the height of the Cold War. And the trilogy begins in 1961 with the Black Sun revolves around a real event. It is the creation of the biggest thermonuclear device ever created, which was tested on October 30th of 1961. This Red Traitor, the second part of the trilogy, is actually also based on real events. In this case, actually two real events, two real stories, both of which fascinated me, and I hope we'll kind of talk about them in more detail later. But the first is the story of arguably the greatest spy the West has ever had within the security establishment of the USSR. And that was a man called Oleg Penkovsky. And he passed crucial secrets to the Americans during about the Soviet missile, specifically about Soviet missile capabilities in the run-up to the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the second story, which is far less well-known than the Penkovsky story, is the story of a drama that occurred on a Soviet submarine. It was called B-59, and it was one of a flotilla of 4 Soviet submarines that was deployed to Cuba, to the Western Caribbean, to the Eastern Caribbean, in the fall of 1962. And each of those submarines carried a nuclear torpedo. And the submarine commanders were each personally authorized, which is basically a unique story in the history of war, that a sort of mid-level field commander had operational control over a nuclear weapon. And those 4 commanders were in charge of submarines that were not in communication with Moscow. And as inevitably, given the scale of the US reaction to the Soviet deployment of missiles on Cuba, on the island of Cuba in October of 1962, they were intercepted by the US Navy. And there was an argument on board the bridge of one of those on the command center. It's not called the bridge, actually. In the command center of one of those submarines, between the commander of the submarine, who wanted to fire his nuclear torpedo, blow the USS Randolph, a US aircraft carrier, out of the water, and undoubtedly start World War III. at the end of October 1962, if a Soviet submarine had blasted a U.S. aircraft carrier from the Second Fleet out of the water on the in just off Cuban waters, that would have been World War III. He was contradicted and overruled by the flotilla commander, who was equal to this guy in rank, but was superior to him in authority. One of the officers commanded the flotilla, one of the other one commands the submarine. And he says, like, don't fire the nuke, don't fire the nuke. And that really happened. That's an absolutely true story. So on, taking these extraordinary human dramatic historic tales, I wound both of them into a thriller. And there you have the basis of Red Traitor. Those are the historical events on which, out of which it's formed. What I added was my hero from Volume 1, who was a former homicide detective, a complicated, intelligent, very honorable man called Alexander Weissen, who is recruited to the KGB. So he is an investigator for a very special department of the KGB, which is charged with investigating the crimes of, private crimes, secret crimes, party crimes, sensitive crimes. And the moral tension of the book, the whole sort of arc of the book, is really about patriotism, and it's about choices. Because it's about a man who is confronted with a choice between obeying orders and actually being a true patriot, which is actually doing something that could save his country from war. And actually, it's a recurring theme in the trilogy. In fact, on the day that this book came out, which was yesterday, I also actually finished the first draft of Volume 3 of the trilogy, which is called White Fox. And in each trilogy, in each part of the trilogy, they pose exactly the same story. They're all standalone stories, but the theme is the same. Is that who looks after the people who claim to be looking after us? Quis custode ipsos custodes. And he, as a KGB man, is ordered to do things that are. He works for a terrifying organization. He himself has some moral qualms about it. Sometimes he enjoys it. It's power. It's very hard to resist power. But fundamentally, I think what I hope makes the drama work, and what makes the protagonist important and interesting to follow, is that you have basically a good man in a bad job, and he is not only a good man, but he's a brave man because he constantly thinks. He makes his own decisions. And in this case, I'm not going to, no plot spoilers in this podcast, but he comes across, comes up against a choice, which is to betray his country in one sense and save it in another, or to obey orders and risk nuclear war breaking out.
So I want you to step back to the beginning. You mentioned that Red Traitor is the second book in a trilogy. You mentioned that you'd finished the draft of the third book. Tell us a little bit about, was it always conceived as a trilogy, and how you went about, for lack of a better word, selling it to a publisher?
Actually, well, it was the first book that I came up with. Inevitably, I think this happens quite often. Is that I had the idea of the first book very clearly, because I had the idea of the bomb. I had the idea of the secret city where the bomb is made, this sort of closed community of scientists, which is sort of perfect closed door setting for a closed door murder mystery, which is what Volume 1 is. And then, of course, there's so much historically interesting things going on, particularly in that period, with the same kind of jeopardy. So I immediately conceived it, thought that this hero could go further, and more importantly, we got a lot of road historically to cover. Because if my thing is I'm weaving a fiction around historical facts, in 1961, We've got the Tsar bomb, as the Americans called it, the biggest thermonuclear device ever created. That's 61. 62, we've got the Cuban Missile Crisis. In 63, we've got the Kennedy assassination. So volume 3 is kind of based on, it's not actually about the Kennedy assassination, but it's based on a secret arising from the Kennedy assassination.
Do you find it difficult to work with the historical fiction based on your background as a journalist?
Well, there's no difference between a historian and a journalist.
Okay.
A journalist writes the first draft of history, famously.
So actually, I'd like you to develop that thinking a little bit further. So, how did your career as being a journalist prepare you to write these books?
That's an excellent question. I mean, I have to say, I'm not very original. I mean, a lot of writers did start out as journalists. I mean, I'm not comparing myself, but like famously Mark Twain and Charles Dickens, and you realize that, I mean, there's a reason why these people, why you can see that they're journalists, because, and this is the answer to your question, is because journalism is about observing, telling details, because journalism, good journalism is not just about telling the dry facts. It's about telling the story and putting it in context, and particularly the kind of journalism that I did. So if you're just doing sort of straight news reporting, that's straight news reporting. But if you're writing like sort of long form, if you're a magazine journalist, I was a magazine journalist. I worked for Newsweek, and especially if you're a magazine foreign correspondent, so you're dealing with places, situations that people are not incredibly familiar with. You're not talking about sort of Donald Trump's latest Twitter outrage, which everyone knows about. You're dealing with writing about sort of Turkish politics or Vladimir Putin or something. So it's really important to set the scene and tell a story. You're a storyteller. And as a journalist, it's really important, firstly, as a reporter, you're talking to people all the time, and you realize very early on in your career that everyone, there's no boring people. Everybody is like weird and interesting in a way that's actually not necessarily, very often, not the thing that they think is most interesting about themselves. And you just chat to them. You just talk to them, and you get the telling detail and the status detail and all these things that tell you, they don't necessarily find their way onto the page, but you as a reporter, because as a reporter, it's a pretty empathetic profession. You need to like show up, chat to someone, get them to tell them things that they don't necessarily want to tell you. Get a sense of whether they're telling you the truth or whether they're bullshitting you, and like what is their agenda and so on. And then you get those details just from observation. So it's a sort of observational profession. How does somebody put on their coat? How do they walk into a room? What do they what is their bearing, their manner, and that's all that stuff that helps you sort of understand the world. As a journalist, you just sort of flip into reverse. And it helps you to create a world by regurgitating those sort of status details and all those quirks, personalities, and tensions and relationships. But and to put it in one sentence, I mean, journalists are just observers of human nature, and novelists are observers. I mean, they're people who conjure human nature on the page. So it's kind of the same job, but it's just a sort of the street goes in two directions.
As a follow up to that, talking about the idea of things that are similar. I mean, both your work, your historical fiction, and your journalism obviously are rooted in facts and rooted in research. Could you tell us some about the research that you did to write Red Traitor and the other books in this series?
Well, yes. I did some great research. In fact, strangely enough, I was both my friend Charles Cumming, who's also a British spy novelist, and myself had both finished books more or less at the same time. So we kind of went out on a wild drunken night last week, and we both were commiserating about like how difficult writing is, of course, because I mean, obviously, I should add very importantly for those of us who are not writers, it's definitely easier than working for a living. Any writer that complains about how difficult writing is, like, no, it's no, working is harder, but writing has its difficulties. But the thing that we agreed with Charles on enormously was how fun the research was. And to answer your question, the research that I did for Red Traitor, the most interesting part of it was to go on a Soviet submarine.
Mm.
And it was a completely bizarre sequence of events because, as it turns out, some guys, just some random guys, who happen to have some interest in like sort of property and sort of waterside properties and like some sort of scrap metal interest, like just acquired in the year 2000 a working Soviet submarine of exactly the same class as the submarine that actually of B-59. It's one of the I mean, they're about 700. No, I tell a lie. There certainly weren't 700 of them. There were about 70 of them made. About 30 of them are still extant, and the one of them is moored in the River Medway in England, just to the east of London, and it's exactly as it was. It has been used for some films, but basically they tried to turn it into a museum. They couldn't, as it turns out. It's extremely difficult to turn a submarine into a museum for an important and interesting reason, which I'll come to in a second. And it's just like moored there, it's like standing there in a river. So I got in touch with these guys, and they said like, yeah, sure, like come along. And we took a boat, climbed onto the submarine, and we spent a day on this submarine, looking over every inch of this damn machine. It was extraordinary. It was extraordinary. Not because I'm a geek. I'm not particularly a geek. I'm kind of interested in submarines, but the thrilling thing for me as a writer and a historian, reading the events that happened that I described earlier on the command in the command center of B-59, literally decisions, an argument between two men that do we fire a nuclear torpedo or do we not fire a nuclear torpedo? Very tense moment, and to see where that would have happened. It's not like the Hunt for Red October. It's not like a sort of a conference room like you see Sean Connery. I mean, the Hunt for Red October is an excellent movie. I think the best submarine movie ever made. Well, no, Das Boot is the best. Anyway, I mean, but the point is that a submarine is an extraordinarily, especially in early 1960s submarine, is an extraordinarily cramped, tiny space, and that command center is literally, you can reach out your arms and touch one bulkhead and touch another bulkhead. That's how big it is. And there are 8 officers in there. And there's 80 men on this ship. And it's 60 meters, 60 yards from one end to the other. I mean, it's 90 meters overall, but there's 10 meters torpedo tubes. Yeah, 70 yards end to end, 80 men inside. 2/3 of the decks, two out of the 3 decks full of batteries. And as a dramatist, you realize that you're actually dealing not only with men under extreme tension, but men literally cooped up inside a machine. You're living inside a machine, surrounded by taps and nozzles and pipes and very sensitive equipment that all has to work in order for you to stay alive. And that part of the research was incredibly interesting for me. And that was really a revelation, because part of the book happens in Moscow. The end game of the book happens on board this submarine, and it was extraordinary to see what that looked like. And I kind of think you have to. You don't, you don't. I mean, obviously, if you're Stanley Kubrick and you're making a space odyssey, you don't necessarily have to go to space. But on the other hand, not that many people have been to space that will tell you like, no, space isn't like that. However, there's something about the verisimilitude. I don't know. Perhaps I'm unusual. Maybe I'm a pedant or something. I mean, I'm really annoyed by like blatant the lack of verisimilitude when a book sounds wrong. Even if it's a fiction book, like
Mhm.
that annoys me. I don't know why, but anyway, I did try to make this book sound right without sort of going full Tom Clancy. I mean, I don't. I think Tom Clancy is like, spends far too much time getting it right and far too little time developing his characters. But I mean, I tried to strike a balance.
It's interesting that you say that, though, when you talk about, for instance, the confines of the command center that you were in, and the idea of creating that or something like that on the page and illustrating it and allowing your readers to create that in one's mind. So I'm curious. We've talked about the fact that this is essentially a spy thriller, and you're working in the spy genre. How do you balance the expected flamboyance of a spy thriller with what's probably a lot of ho hum tedium in real life? How do you strike that balance and come up with a reasonable mixture?
Hmm. Well, you just don't write about the boring bits. I mean, that's the short answer. I mean, uh, I mean, every scene. I mean, it's screenwriting is actually rather an interesting um, introduction to thrillers. And if you don't want to read any screenplays, you can just like watch drama. I mean, television drama, like good television drama. It's a much better indication than film because film is a different form. Anyway, but the point is that every single the rule is that action has to reveal character. That's the rule of screenwriting, and every scene and every dialogue has to move the plot forward, and doesn't necessarily have to move the plot forward in a dramatic way, because actually what you're supposed to care about, what drives you through, what keeps you, listening and watching is and reading is that you care about the characters. So every, you know, as nothing can happen in a scene, but it can still be dramatic because you have a dramatic conversation. So actually, the thriller is not necessarily all about action.
As you were writing, did you find anything? Did you discover anything about yourself in the writing process of this book?
um, hmm. uh, Well, that's an excellent question, Michael. Yes, I suppose I did. I mean, uh, the thing is, I mean, all fiction is. I mean, there's a truism that all writing is autobiography. So actually, all of it comes from inside you. I mean, however many submarines you may visit, or however many memoirs you may read, and in this case, I actually did read some of the key memoirs of the participants of the drama on B-59. So the but however much research you do, it's still it's still coming from your mind, and all these people are based on people that you've met. So um, the I mean, once again, I think that the this is going to sound really dumb and embarrassing, but actually, um, this it's a miracle. It's just a weird thing that happens. It's like there's a radio in your head. You have the story, it's sort of basically sort of A B C D. The structure is there, and then you start to write, and suddenly it's like you're sort of tuned in to like a signal, and then like holy holy cow, like I just like that scene appeared in my head, and like this conversation appeared in my head. It just sort of comes to you. It's really strange. If you're kind of in the mood, somewhere from deep inside or up above, I don't know. I'm whatever your personal belief systems may be, but it comes from somewhere, and you don't know where it's from, and then it's on the page, and you think like, God damn, that's great. But
Do you ever
it's like it's not even from it just came to you. It's like thanks, guy, whoever that was that put that in my head.
do you ever to kind of stick with that metaphor? Do you ever find static in that radio that something comes out and it doesn't just quite jibe with what you were either thinking or how you hoped or expected it to come out?
Michael, you're asking me all of these personal questions about my writing process, which are going to force me to reveal to you that the terrible secret is that actually writers spend like 80% of their time drinking whiskey and watching Netflix. Just like the rest of you guys. It's like, maybe you don't know. No, you're like sort of you're busy people. But anyway, unfortunately, yes, most writing is actually not writing. Most writing is. Actually, I read a really funny moment, a really funny thing, and I hate to misattribute it, so I'm just trying to think about who said this. Maybe it wasn't Martin Amis. Was it Robert Harris? Anyway, some great contemporary or semi-contemporary writer said, you have to give like time for the boys in the back room to work. Which is actually like by which he meant you have to sort of all that time drinking whiskey and like watching Netflix is not wasted because like somewhere in the back room the boys are working.
Mm-hmm.
Although I wonder whether that's just like an excuse for writers just to sort of like procrastinate, like, oh, that's okay that I sort of just kicked back, like I didn't do any writing today because the boys in the back room are working. I don't know, but it's true that yeah, most of the most of a writer's life is getting rid of static, and what writers talk about when they meet each other is like how you get rid of the static. I have to say, it's actually like a terrible admission and a really awful blow to the sort of bohemian image of how writers should live. But actually, frankly, the thing that really works is actually just to be on your own in a lovely lonely place and just be sort of sober and healthy. Actually, that really works. I mean, I need to try it sometime. I mean, on the few times that I have tried it, it works. I need to do it as a sort of regular thing. Ernest Hemingway, for instance, he would like he'd like check into hotels in in cities that he'd never been to, and like sit there with a typewriter and just like work away. And you have to work. I mean, this is the thing is that if you are a professional writer, you realize that inspiration doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. I mean, there's no such thing as inspiration. If the inspiration, said Dorothy Parker, is for amateurs, and that's actually true, because if you write for a living, you have to write. Sometimes it comes, sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not. It's not good, but you have to sit down and do it. And actually, I'm sure you watched the latest Ken Parks documentary on Hemingway. It was beautiful. It's a masterpiece, like so Ken Burns'
Mm-hmm.
work. Ken Burns, Hemingway, and one of the things is a leitmotif throughout Hemingway's life. When he's not, getting drunk, marrying people, shooting big game, fishing for marlins and so on. But like every single day he is working. It's an obsession for him, and that's kind of what you have to do. You have to just sort of sit down in the morning. Well, I say in the morning. I mean in the like basically sort of within 2 hours of rising from your bed, which in my case is 2 p.m. and sit down and write and force yourself. And sometimes something comes, sometimes it doesn't.
Do you find that you have to mentally shift gears if you are working more in your journalism field versus your writing fiction, or can you just toggle back and forth between those without giving it a whole lot of consideration?
The really terrible thing, Michael, is when I get them confused, and when I write a news story that is completely made up. And no, I'm joking. I'm joking. No, it's actually it's. Yeah, I still write quite a lot of journalism, and
Right.
it's actually super. It's actually really important. It's kind of like exercising different muscles.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you've just sort of been doing your legs obsessively, and then
Right.
suddenly you do like some crunches or like sort of punch lift some heavy things above your head, whatever that's called. You know, the you know, it actually sort of one helps the other, because you're just sort of switching around, and you're the thing about journalism is if you've done it for as long as I have, it's just 25 years. I mean, it's actually it's a skill. It's actually a rather beautiful skill. It's like sort of being able to throw a pot or something. You know, it's sort of, you can turn a nice piece quickly, efficiently. You know, you fool some people, and you can do it. It's a skill set that you have and you enjoy exercising. And I'm sure, you know, all of us have different skill sets. You know, someone is like, you know, you might be a great fly fisherman, or, you know, whatever it may be, you know, or like a sort of barbecue master. No, did I not? I'm trying to guess, Michael. I'm just looking at you.
I offered you these questions ahead of time. Don't you forget that.
Those things, right? I don't know
Um,
whatever your personal skill set is. I mean, it's beautiful and satisfying to be able to exercise something that you do skillfully and well.
sure, sure. I would think that, just based on what my own limited experience, that there would be an economy and economy of words and precision associated with journalism that is really valuable in terms of writing fiction, but you would certainly rely upon that economy and that precision much more in your journalism.
Well, that's a very it's actually very interesting line of questioning, Michael, because actually nobody ever has ever asked me about my process in this detail. So it's actually very interesting to think about it and answer. Um, Let me put it this way: when someone sends you, when like a friend sends you a manuscript, that terrible moment when you just realize that, you know, you're just going to lose 2 hours of your life that you're never going to get back, you know? And, you know, it's immediately obvious when you write something that's written by someone who isn't a writer. It's obvious that they're not a writer, they're not a professional writer, and the obvious thing about their writing is that they are careless with words. They overuse words. They use too many words. They don't, you know, they're showing off. They think that when you know, putting together, you know, one beautiful phrase and another beautiful phrase, and it's writing. Well, I mean, it's kind of, maybe it is writing, but it's not. What it definitely isn't is storytelling. So, you know, like maybe if they like sort of publish their work in like haiku form, and like sort of you know, and it was like sort of 8,000 haikus. You know, like, no, maybe that would work, but because it's like prose poetry and it's sort of too beautiful. But the point is that you have to, you know, you know, certainly as a, I mean, this maybe doesn't obviously it doesn't apply necessarily to someone like sort of Isabel Allende, but actually, strangely enough, like even people who you think are like a sort of super literary, super cerebral, sort of, you know, the opposite of thriller writers, like someone like Isabel Allende or sort of magical realists, or Gabriel Garcia Marquez. I mean, they actually, you know, Borges, you know, okay, the most Borges, Nabokov, you know, but they still tell a story.
Mhm.
That's the point. Like, however literary they may be, and however sort of, but they still have the sort of beginning, middle, and end. They still like sort of, there's the hook at the beginning.
Mhm.
They get you, like, what's going to happen to this thing, and obviously, like, thriller writing is the most sort of primitive. It's the most sort of upfront in that form, because thriller writing is actually extremely structural, and it's all about throwing you in the middle of action. But strangely enough, I think it's one of the things that sort of most writers struggle with, or many writers sort of don't understand, is that it's not about the prose; it's about the story. Two different things.
Very, very, very well said. Thank you. I think you're going to be thrilled that I actually have a question from somebody that I didn't make it up myself. So this was from one of our folks who's listening in. They're curious if you have in mind writing a book about the Balkan region in mind.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, I actually spent a bit of time in the Balkans as straight out of university. Actually, it was my first war. Actually, I spent most of my career doing covering wars as a journalist. And I started in Sarajevo in Bosnia in 1994. So it was like during the siege of Sarajevo, and it made a huge impression on me. In fact, because it was my first war, as I just said. It was the first time I'd ever been in that zone. It became a lifetime addiction actually, because it was like stepping off the world. It's there are moments that the most relatable way to describe war reporting, and the reason why I'm interested in the Balkans and all wars, but is that the most relatable point about it is like it's like when your wife is giving birth, or if you have the misfortune like sort of being really ill, you know, it's that moment where nothing matters at all except the place and the time you are in. Nobody can say anything to you. Like nobody can say like sort of what are you doing? Like my wife is in labor. Like oh shit. Like okay sorry. Like you're there. It's absolute flow. It's absolute flow. And there was the Sarajevo was the first place that I experienced that extreme flow that you get from a war zone. In fact, that's why it's so addictive. It's not danger. I mean, if you want danger, then sort of do um, skydiving and sort of what's it called,
Wing walking?
sorry,
Wing
yeah, yeah,
walking?
yeah, wing walking, whatever. Whatever. I mean, but this is not it's not about sort of danger in that sense. It's about sort of just random decisions that you may make. You walk out of the door and you turn left, not right, and you may not arrive. That the proximity of violent death is extraordinarily exciting. And the Balkans is the first place. I realize the question is not about why do you love wars? It's why do you write a book about them? But the Balkans was the first place that I experienced war, and it was colored by, and the first place I ever lived abroad that for us after university was Budapest, which is obviously not the Balkans. Um, don't kill me, Hungarians. I said it's not the Balkans. They really get upset about that. Hungary is Central Europe, just so that you're very clear about that. It's Central Europe. But the Balkans are relatively close. And that whole atmosphere of marginal Europe is actually really interesting. And especially to answer your listener's question, I am writing a book about the Balkans. In fact, I'm writing about the book in the Balkans where I'm sort of noodling a historical series that's set in a slightly earlier epoch. It's in fact in the run up to the First World War.
Mm.
It actually starts. The first volume is set in London, St. Petersburg, Port Arthur, and which is the Russo-Japanese War, and St. Petersburg. So that's from 1904 to 5. But very quickly, we're going to get to the Balkans in 1912, the Second Balkan War. And what interests me about the Balkans, particularly in that period, I mean, now the Balkans, it's the EU and everything, but the Balkans at that point were the interface between what Christendom considered civilization and barbarism. So the concept of civilization and barbarism was born, in fact, very close to the Balkans. It was born in the Greek colonies of Crimea and of South Russia. That was where the first literary use of the term barbaroi. Barbaroi in Greek means someone who says ba ba ba. It means a nonsense speaker is the origin of the term barbarian. The point is, it was where colonial Greeks came in contact with the Oriental world in the form of Scythians, and we're talking about sort of 5th to the 3rd centuries BC now, in the Black Sea, not far from I mean, obviously, Romania and Bulgaria are on the Black Sea, and that since after the Ottoman conquest of the Balkans, you have that sort of constant conflict between an essentially alien culture. Christendom, through the whole history of the medieval and early modern period, defined itself in opposition to something, just as the modern world, during the Cold War, the Western world defined itself in opposition to the Soviet Union. The medieval world defined itself in opposition to Islam, to the forces of the Turk or the Mohammedanism. And the Balkans were this sort of battleground between good and evil by the lights of that time. And it's really interesting when you sort of scroll to the very end of that epochal sort of Game of Thrones style kind of struggle, that actually, right at the beginning of the 20th century, in kind of, in a semi-recognizable world, it's only like 100 years ago. It's like 110 years ago, but yet you still have a whole area of what is now practically Europe, still torn with these really interesting divisions, deep cultural divisions between Islam and Christendom, and also different conceptions of what Christendom is, of what Europe is, because of course most of the Balkans are Orthodox, and this whole idea, like they are of Europe, but they're like us, but they're kind of not like us in a slightly sinister way, like I guess Canadians must be to you.
Oh my goodness. Well, I've got one basic last question for you, and it really is a relatively easy one. Well, it may be, it may not be. I thought most of mine were pretty easy. So, do you have a favorite book that you've read that just jumps to mind as something you just identify with, love, read for comfort, keep coming back to, that sort of thing?
Well, I do actually, but strange enough, they're actually two different things, because it's quite a lot of books that I read for comfort, because I just find them so brilliant and funny. But actually, the notion of comfort is an interesting one, because how does comfort fit with favorite? I mean, is your favorite book your most comforting book? I mean, I guess one of your favorite books is and that would be Winnie the Pooh. No, I'm joking. It's not. It's not Winnie the Pooh. Although Winnie the Pooh is actually really interesting, by the way. Did you know that Winnie the Pooh, A. Milne was actually a Taoist? He was like an Eastern philosopher. He was really into Tao, and the whole of Pooh is actually a Taoist fable. And Pooh is in fact the word Pu, is the ultimate virtue in Taoism of self-abnegation and of harmony and of rejection of the world, and all of the different characters, Rabbit and Piglet and Owl and Eeyore and so on, are all embodiments of various human vices. So actually, even Winnie the Pooh is actually much deeper than many people realize. But anyway, the book I read most often for comfort, this is a bit of an embarrassing revelation, it's probably Flashman. Come across Flashman? You've never read Flashman?
No, tell us, please.
George MacDonald Fraser. It came out in 1969. It's actually a little bit politically incorrect, but it's these days. But it's a fictional biography of a young, extremely arrogant, but intelligent young officer in 1840s Britain. And he has this career. He's actually a coward and a womanizer and a drinker, and by accident he manages to become a hero repeatedly over and over again. And actually, he rather like the characters in my fiction. Actually, the George MacDonald Fraser inserts Flashman into every single possible great event of mid 19th century Victorian conflict, and he's in China. He's at the charge of the Light Brigade. He's in Afghanistan. That's the first book. in 1842, the first Afghan War, and he keeps meeting these great historical characters. But anyway, I find that comforting because I find it funny, and I find it well written. But I wouldn't say that's my favorite book. It's the one that I reread for fun and pleasure, just to switch my mind off. My favorite book, that's actually there are categories. I mean, the best book of reportage by far ever written, I would say, was Dispatches by Michael Herr, which is extraordinarily precise. It's very honest, and most importantly, what makes it work is it's a very unhistrionic memoir of Michael Herr's time as a war correspondent in Vietnam. And if you only read one part of it, the chapter on Khe Sanh is absolutely definitive. It's devastating because it's so dry, it's so precise, and it's so moving at the same time. And I think that's sort of the most that a writer can aspire to, is actually to tell less with more. To tell less with more, no. To tell more with less is the key. It's to tell more with less. And actually, sort of secondly, I mean, I just watched as I told you earlier, I just watched Ken Burns, and I've just been actually rediscovering Hemingway, and of course, you realise that he's sort of the granddaddy of us all in that sense, because it's all about conveying, you know, the intensity of mood, intensity of feeling and emotion with very precise and tight, dry language. So actually, and in fact, I would say that For Whom the Bell Tolls, it's not a very original choice, but I think that For Whom the Bell Tolls is was an enormously influential book for me, because it told me, I mean, it taught me how to, that you could create drama without fireworks, without histrionics, without, well, that you could create an extraordinarily compelling story with a very with just with honesty and with economy. And actually, of course, that's the most difficult thing to do. In terms of the best thrillers, that's a much easier question to answer, because The Day of the Jackal is just endlessly entertaining. It's brilliantly written, and it's really interesting actually. If you reread, one of the problems with being a writer, it's like sort of being a problem. It's like being a sort of professional wine sommelier. You know, you can't just open a bottle of wine and say, "Great, nice, I'm going to drink that bottle of that." No, you can't do that, because you've become a sommelier. You like can't, you know, just like drink a bottle of wine because it's fine. No, you can't. Just in the same way, as a writer, particularly a writer of thrillers, you know, you start to read everything that you read extremely forensically, and, you know, extreme detail, and you start to sort of pick apart, like, oh, what did he do there, and what did he do there, and which kind of, in some ways, sort of makes you a kind of weirdly, sort of a weird reader, weird type of reader, but also it sort of somewhat takes away the sort of the visceral pleasure of it. But my point is that the Day of the Jackal is a really interesting thriller, because perhaps you'd agree, Michael, that it's a brilliant thriller, and but it's like a book written without the letter E or something. There's an enormous flaw in it, and that is that there is no main character. I mean, the jackal, actually, there are two main flaws. One, the jackal is just this shell. He's like a smooth carapace. He has no character. There's nothing that he does that is revealing of his character. There's like sort of one tiny little sort of moment where he says, like, when he's like has his nose pressed up to a shop window when he's 10 and he like sees a nice suit or something. But like otherwise, like the character, the central character, the jackal, is not a character but a persona. And the other thing is that Forsyth can't do dialogue. The dialogues are basically non-existent. No one talks to anyone in that book. And yet, despite those two extraordinary handicaps, which you'd think were like sort of totally crippled book, it's an extraordinary book. It has extraordinary pace, and it's what technical term for it is actually it's a procedural thriller. Someone is trying to get from A to B through a series of very technical tasks, and of course the Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy is, and of course, a masterpiece it's a masterpiece of 20th century fiction. It's actually, because it happens to be about spies, it's sort of dismissed into genre fiction, and it's considered to be a spy thriller. It's considered a spy novel and a thriller. It's not a thriller. It's not thrilling at all. Actually, it's just, well, I mean, it's somewhat thrilling, but it's not structured as a thriller. It's just as structured as it's just a brilliant and important 20th century novel, and Le Carré is a master and a genius. And actually, I would say also a Little Drummer Girl, The Little Drummer Girl. One of his actually slightly less well-known books, but actually, The Little Drummer Girl is what I like. Is what I like about thrillers, is that it actually has an incredibly believable background. And finally, you asked me for one book, I gave you 6 so far. The 7th is Hilary Mantel, of things that I've recently read. Is the Cromwell trilogy, particularly Wolf Hall. That just for the vividness of and the brilliance of how she conjures that world, with utterly convincing.
That you've given us some great recommendations there, and I'm glad you did elaborate on that to give us so many different ones to think about and consider. I really want to take time to thank you for your time tonight to talk to us about your new book and Red Traitor, and we certainly wish you well with it and your subsequent work, your next book, and all of your endeavors.
Thank you very much, Michael. I appreciate you having me on.
Well, thank you all for joining us. We hope you're going to join us for another Virtual Authors at Your Library event in the not so distant future, and we hope to be offering in-person events in the not so distant future at Barr Memorial Library in Fort Knox. Again, Mr. Matthews, thank you for your time. Everyone else, thank you for signing in. Have a good evening.
You too.
Thank you.